Chapter 7, Galantos 2. Captain Rivager Tullius. Captain, these plans are unusable. I closed my eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, but the attempts at calming my nerves were for naught. The chief of the Conqueror's engineering section, a large man shaved bald, held a stack of datapads, filled with the information collected from the escapade and my interview with the Pwek crew. His disbelief was something I shared, even if it wasn't with the same intensity. I understand your issues with the reports. I'm not asking you to believe them, I said diplomatically, trying to detach myself from the argument as I walked to the elevator, but the man stayed glued to me. He wielded the datapad like a mace, whipping it around as he spoke. Spirituality and blood sacrifices are not engineering. I've had my teams rip these starfighters apart, pore over every inch, and do you know what we found? Am I supposed to guess? They shouldn't work. The man continued as if I hadn't spoken, so lost in his own world as he was. I grumbled under my breath, speeding up only for him to keep pace. I don't need them to work, just how they may work. Have the Pwek walk you through it, just give me something I can report when we're in the core. I tried that, the man said petulantly, hardly acting his age or rank. It started normal enough. How does the propulsion system work? What fuel do they use for the blasters? But then they insisted that we needed to feed the damn things life energy to make them work. Then note that in the report, the elevators came into view and I barely stopped myself from breathing a sigh of relief, whatever their exact words were. If you must, just try not to offend them. Spiritual or not, they are the only ones who know how that cruiser works, and I would rather stay on their good side. The engineer's sour expression grew darker, but he nodded with a defeated sigh. Yes, Captain. Good man, I said as the elevator doors closed, and I was granted a brief reprieve as I rose to the bridge. Unfortunately, the heavy and cold weight in my hand served as a sterling reminder that there were other problems I needed to address, a list that grew by the hour, or so it seemed. The doors opened, and the rumbling chaos of the rear bridge filled my ears. I took in a deep breath and stepped forward. The sharp snap of leather boots met my entry, the pair of Navy troopers on duty announcing my arrival to the bridge at large. Despite my extended absence from the management of my ship, the crew saluted me with the same discipline as always. It almost hid the fact that I had been run from the bridge like a naughty schoolboy. I marched forward, nodding to the officers I passed, and was met halfway to the forward bridge by Lieutenant Skrield. She stopped a pace in front of me and offered a regulation salute of her own. Captain Tullius, she said in greeting, moving to rest at my dismissal, I see you learned of our imminent arrival before I had the chance to warn you. We are 30 minutes out from the Nzoth system. After we resupply, it's an hour's jump to Galantos. Almost home, I thought, but I kept the giddiness from my face. Very good, Lieutenant, I said, keeping my tone frosty. I see you have been keeping things in good order, as expected. Skrield preened under the compliment, which was a bit surprising. Did she think I expected her to fail? Still, a more vindictive part of me wanted to snatch away that moment of victory, so I held up my right hand. Lieutenant, do you know what this is? I asked. A bar of metal. Is that a question, Lieutenant? A bar of metal, sir. Indeed it was. A large slab of metal was held aloft in my hand, dull grey with the Mining Guild logo stamped on the top, followed by an identification number. Correct. More specifically, it is a refined bar of carvanium. At that moment, recognition flashed across Skrield's face, followed closely by worry and apprehension. She seemed to remember something she forgot to report. Skrield opened her mouth to respond, but I was quicker. A nifty mineral, carvanium. It is used in many everyday metal alloys, from shipbuilding to blasters to construction. Chief among these is durasteel, one with which we are familiar. It is also a temperamental material. Too much and durasteel becomes brittle, too little and likes to warp under heat, so you always need to add a precise amount of it to the alloy. Finally, I looked back to Skrield's eyes. Lieutenant, why are 4,000 metric tons of these bars in my cargo bay? Skrield looked from my face to the bar in my hand. She was rapidly trying to think of an explanation, I could recognize those quirks in her expression. "I apologize for failing to report their presence, Captain," she said after a long pause, continuing, "I deemed their collection a worthwhile endeavor to address the fleet's recent expenditures." I looked down at the bar in my hand again, gently shaking it to and fro as I tried to balance its weight. My glove, largely ceremonial and for show, did little to stop the creeping chill coming from its surface. There was merit in Skriol's choices, though I was still peeved she acted in such a way without my go-ahead. I could hardly criticize her for her actions, but I could for how she took them. If Skriol allowed herself to be dragged off at any opportunity, then the crew might start to believe I had no control over her, if they didn't already. That, or she was acting within my orders, which was worse. Still, weighing the potential consequences of her actions against the real value of the bar in my hands, I found the promise of credit soothed my annoyance. However, I lacked any knowledge in metallurgy beyond what I had hastily researched on my way here and did not know where or how we could offload the supply. Still, I could not let Skriol think I completely agreed with her actions, could I? I set my lips into a firm line and handed the bar to Skriol, who took it with a bemused expression. "I see," was all I offered before turning to the forward bridge. I entered, Skriol trailing behind me as she awkwardly held the refined metal bar, and looked over the controlled chaos of my bridge. The navigation, communication, and sensor teams were at their station, preparing for a smooth transition into real space. Gunnery commanders and officers were also at the ready. A pervasive paranoia had spread across the bridge in light of our recent troubles. The next half-hour passed by slowly, characterized by familiarizing myself with the goings-on of the Conqueror and the fleet since our departure from Baccarat. Despite the troubles, the crew were in high spirits. The closer we were to loyal Imperial space, the more hopeful they became. It was a sentiment I shared. The sooner we were back in the core, the sooner I could return to my comfortable place of following orders rather than making them. "Reversion to real space in 15 seconds, the navigation officer announced. The swirling blue vortex seemed to stretch as the hyperdrive lost power, slowly dragging us out of the mind-numbing dimension and back to reality. A pressure built up behind my eyes, forcing me to blink. My ears popped as real space snapped into place in front of the Conqueror, an endless expanse of nothingness, and the pale star at the center of the Nzoth system. I shuddered, and after a moment the wrongness of hyperspace faded from my memory. I turned to Skriol and nodded to her. "Command is still yours, Lieutenant. I will be in the rear bridge." "Sir," Skriol saluted me, still carrying the damned bar of Carvanium, before leaving to give her orders. I did the same, finding my stomping grounds as I had left them. I would never admit as much to my crew, little more than anyone else, but the rest over the last few weeks had done wonders for my mental state. I had not realized how short my temper had become, nor how unfocused I was in day-to-day life until I enjoyed many more hours of sleeping. Within minutes, we were connected to the local battlenet, allowing me up-to-date information in the system. My eyes were naturally drawn to a trio of massive figures holding over the titular Nzoth itself, superstar destroyers. Being in the presence of the Executor had been awe-inspiring due to its reputation, but having served in the Arrowhead I had seen my fair share of star dreadnoughts. That being said, a thrill of trepidation ran up my spine at the sight of them. The largest was a copy of the Executor, another of the line by the name Intimidator. Following that in size was a Mandator III, the Rampage. The last was the smallest, but by no means weak. The Armadir was a Bellator class, a pocket star dreadnought if such a phrase had any real meaning. Any one of the three was a match for my entire fleet twice over, and together may have been a threat to Arrowhead Command as a whole. Their fleet was equally massive. The Black Fleet was viewed as the boogeymen of the deep core. Positioned to race into the region in the event of an invasion from there, a sterling reminder that the Empire had learned from the Clone Wars. "We are being hailed, Captain," one officer said from his station, turning to face me. I nodded, calling through the bridge doors. "I shall take this, Lieutenant." "Aye, sir." She responded back, her voice echoing through the doorway. I pulled my code cylinder from my breast pocket and activated the communicator, accepting the request. "Arrowhead Command, this is the Intimidator." Forward identification codes now. Received, Intimidator. Sending identification. It was one thing to run around with the transponder of a fleet, it was another to have the appropriate access codes. While I wasn't part of Arrowhead Command's inner circle, my credentials would at least confirm I was part of the fleet. Identity confirmed. Welcome to Nzoth, Captain. Please state your business. With the messy problem of identification out of the way, the communications officer was notably more pleasant, or as much as a communications officer could be, in any case. We are passing through on our way to the core from Endor. I request permission to dock with Black 15 for resupply. Wait 1. The communications channel went dead, and I was left standing in silence as I waited for the technician to return. A chill rose up my spine, a certain wariness that was becoming increasingly common as of late. Unfortunately, Nzoth was not a place I could fight my way out of, not like Baccarat or Roth Station. Finally, a voice spoke again. This one was far more cultured and carried authority. This is Admiral Jean Perret. You are a long way from Endor, Conqueror. Suspicion dripped from the man's voice. It is a complicated story, sir, I said, the weight of the last few weeks laying heavy on my mind. However, unaware of what had been transpiring in the Greater Empire due to my furlough, I decided to fish for information, though I am certain you are more aware of the goings-on than I. The silence that followed stretched for long enough that I feared we had lost connection. When Perret spoke again, it was a tense and hesitant voice. We shall speak of this more face to face. You are being forwarded of course to Black 15. We have space for your flag, but the rest will need to wait. Understood, I said immediately, despite my growing apprehension. This was all starting to feel very familiar. I will arrive shortly, Admiral. Very good. Intimidator, out. The communication line closed, leaving me back in the familiar din of the bridge. My hand rose to stroke my cheek, running first over my burns and then my cheek in a familiar nervous tic. Unfortunately, flight was even less likely here than it was at Baccarat or Roth. An entire fleet was stationed here, with control of a communications relay and hyperwave sensors. They could jump across the entire system and head us off before we had time to punch in the coordinates. The holomap lit up, showcasing a new course charted for my section. Directly into the heart, and overlapping firing arcs, of a fleet several times my size. Captain? Maitred asked from behind, though I did not turn to face him. An uneasy crossing, Commander, I told the old chief, folding my hands behind my back. I've walked us willingly into too many traps already. We've almost made it, sir, Maitred argued, likely sensing what I was going to say. One more distraction, and then we're home. I clenched my fists, staring at the galactic map hovering near the system's representation. Agitated, I waved a hand over the map to dismiss it, refocusing on the local system. The trio of star dreadnoughts felt more like the laser gate of a prison. And ramming these would do me far more harm than good. Lieutenant Skriold, follow the heading graciously provided by our hosts, I ordered, tapping a finger on the rim of the holotable. Yes, Captain, Skriold responded immediately, no sign of trepidation in her voice as the Conqueror burned unerringly toward Black 15. Black 15 was a familiar Type 2 orbital repair yard, with docking bays like long angular arms stretching out from the cylindrical body. Star destroyers and smaller vessels were attached to several bays, with many more drifting not far away. Some bays still held half-completed hulls ranging a number of different capital ships, each under heavy construction and hidden beneath a swarm of service vessels. The Conqueror was directed to one bay, flanked on either side by two fully constructed star destroyers, though it was clear that all but the strictly necessary lights were off. We slid slowly into the waiting grasp of the docking clamps, Skriold carefully giving orders to the helmsman. When only a few kilometers separated us from the station, control was surrendered to the station controllers. Tractor beams, far from capable of resisting us if we wanted to escape, gently guided the Conqueror the rest of the way into the clamps. In the emptiness of space, I could not hear those mechanical hands close, but a distant hiss filled the back of my mind with an perturbing finality. Unless we were released by the station, the Conqueror was going nowhere. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, turning to face Skriold. "I will meet with the Admiral. The Conqueror is yours, Lieutenant." Skriold saluted me. Was that a hint of apprehension in her eyes? I didn't know, nor did I dare ask, as I turned from the bridge and marched to the elevator. The tram ride across the Conqueror was quiet and tense. I sat at the front of the small lift, uncomfortably pushed forward by the number of occupants. Half a dozen stormtroopers sat behind and across from me, holding the carbines in their laps due to the lack of room. It was paranoid to bring so many guards, and ultimately a fruitless gesture if the Admiral had poorly boding plans for me. What were half a dozen stormtroopers, no matter their skill, against a station of defenders? Still, their presence calmed my nerves, if only somewhat. Nestled on the opposite bench between the burly soldiers was Wilik Narus, looking particularly unhappy about this turn of events. To be entirely honest, I wasn't sure what he could add to this conversation, beyond lending credence to my story. Still, it was either him, Ree, or one of the people I did not know aboard the escapade. There was also a more mercenary perspective to consider. Narus was a better hostage than I was, and Narus could lend some authority with his rank that I could not. The two of us were dishonored. I had gotten lost in my fleet and he had lost his planet, but he was the higher-ranked dishonored fool. If worse came to worse, I could use the tried and true naval tradition of blaming everything on him. I have been invited to meet one Admiral Jean Perret. Myself and Governor Narus will speak with and appraise him of the situation in the Model sector. After, we shall leave. I think it would behoove us to remain mindful and respectful of our fellow Imperials. They are in a difficult part of space after all. In other words, if or when they try to detain us, please do not kill anyone. I was certain my eventual return to the Corps would not be the triumph I dreamed of, but rather one filled with difficult questions about where in the blazes I had been for the last few months. The stormtroopers did not respond, to their credit, though I saw hands tighten around the grips of their carbines. The concept of not fighting appeared to rankle the soldiers, but I hoped loyalty would win out over bloodlust. After all, many of the stormtroopers were not granted the honor of boarding the now-named escapade, a fact that appeared to anger many troopers if my sources were to be believed. I longed for the day when I could return to the Arrowhead, my days filled with boring patrols and long reports, where the highlight was a good cup of CF and the quiet hum of a bridge at work. The tram turned the final corner, ending at the starboard docking bay. A large blast door covered one wall, flanked by a team of beleaguered-looking Navy troopers. With so many of their numbers aboard the escapade or scattered among the fleet, the Conqueror's complement had been forced into double and even triple shifts. While there had been no reports of rumblings among the ranks, I was canny enough to know it was inevitable. They were all being compensated accordingly, out of my pocket, of course. With each day that passed, my funds appeared lighter and lighter. I had never considered myself a miserly man, up until everyone and their mother had their hands in my purse. Still, it brought a strange joy to my heart with the sudden reaction my presence made. Their exhaustion disappeared in a heartbeat, each man straightening into a crisp salute and standing at attention as I dismounted my hovering chariot. The good nature and pride vanished with the processed wind as my eyes beheld the web turret being carried around the next corner, alongside another dozen Navy troopers. It would seem paranoia was not limited to just me, and my crew were not eager to take chances. "The docking umbilical has been secured, Captain," the leading sergeant announced, lowering his arm at my gesture. I tore my gaze from the turret being set up across from the blast door. I would need to defuse this situation before the local station garrison got the wrong idea. "Very good, Sergeant. I see you have broken out our heavy weapon complement," I said, gesturing to the weapon team nearby, but before I could continue the man spoke over me. "We didn't have time to pull up heavier hardware." He sounded apologetic, embarrassed that his preparations didn't include more. The man straightened again. "Better safe than sorry, Captain. I've been informed another team is en route, just in case the locals get a little handsy, as it were." I thought bitterly, of course. My gallant saviors, ready to rescue their captain if or when he is entrapped again. Of course, given my current track record the last 2 times I interacted with other Imperials, last 3, if one counted Chick trying to make me commit to his death pact, then perhaps this preparation was necessary? Then again, the entire complement of Navy troopers, stormtroopers, and every other armed security officer across the section could throw themselves through that docking platform and still likely be outnumbered 10 to 1. I raised a hand, making the wave the web away, at least until I was away, but the blast door suddenly opened. A loud hiss filled the hallway, revealing a welcoming team of 3 men in grey uniforms. The lead man, a younger fellow with a black goatee, opened his mouth to greet us before choking on his words. His bright eyes were wide as he took in me, my security, and their overwhelming firepower. I sighed, a quiet thing so as not to appear as if I hadn't planned this and lacked control of my crew. In all fairness, I did, but the Black 15 crew didn't need to know that. Forestalling any argument or call for reinforcements, I stepped forward across the threshold and snapped my heels together. Captain Rivager Tullius, 2nd Flank Squadron, Arrowhead Command. This is Governor Wylick Narus of Baccara. Am I to assume that you are here to bring us to Admiral Jean Perret? My words stirred a reaction from the trio, all of them quickly snapping off crisp if hasty salutes. Yes, Captain. Will your guards be coming with us? The man's nervous gaze passed over the throng of Navy troopers, freezing longer on what I assumed was the blaster cannon. I glanced back, wincing as I saw another pair of Navy troopers arrive to put a durasteel barricade in front of the web, providing cover for its operators. By the time I returned, I feared I would find trench lines in my hallway. Just the stormtroopers, myself, and Governor Narus. Will that be acceptable? Yes, Captain. Please, follow me. The trio spun on their heels and set off at a brisk pace, clearly eager to not be so close to such a well-armed welcoming party, doubly so when their own guards stood at the other end of the hallway. Without a glance to my chosen party, I took off after them, matching their lockstep alongside the stormtroopers. Narus strove to keep up somewhere to my right, still holding his tongue as his grim expression was set forward. Beyond the blast door on the other side of the docking tunnel, a comparatively small team of 4 Navy troopers greeted us, alarm and caution in their gazes as they took in the newcomers. Alongside them were a pair of aliens dressed in robes, the species of which I did not recognize. They were both tall relative to the humans they stood among. Though their robes were baggy and voluminous, it was clear that the aliens were skeleton in their limbs and bodies. What skin that was exposed appeared to be rough and dry. Their faces both held red, spiked crests that swelled and deflated with their breathing. Their faces were vaguely humanoid, but not to the point that I could read their expressions. Their eyes were set into similarly skeletal heads, with elongated skulls that were covered in rough skin and spikes. They were far from the strangest aliens I had ever seen, but I could help but wonder what they were doing here. I expect I am to be disarmed? I asked, reaching for the holster at my hip. My actions were mirrored by Narus, though his expression said he would rather have not done that, but we were stopped by a swift shake of the young officer's head. Good heavens, no. We could never expect you to be unarmed aboard the station. That gave me pause. My hand hovered over the faux leather holster for a moment longer before awkwardly sliding back down my leg. I see, I said, patting at the flare of my trousers for a moment before continuing, then lead the way, we should not keep the Admiral waiting. The younger officer nodded his head and signaled down the long, featureless hallway for us to follow. So our motley assortment of officers, stormtroopers, and alien attendants set out down the empty passage. Now away from my heavily armed security team, the younger officer had calmed enough to slow his stride and converse. I wasn't sure how much to say to him, nor what the galaxy at large knew about Endor at this point, but he appeared willing enough to do most of the speaking. Black 15 is the most advanced repair facility in the Empire, the man explained, walking alongside me as we turned a corner, state-of-the-art repair drones, extensive crew facilities, an advanced repulsor and tractor suite for course correction and directing starships. I see, I said slowly, eyes scanning the featureless walls in an attempt to identify these advanced features. I had been aboard Type 2s before, and docked at many more. They were the space station equivalent of a dreadnought heavy cruiser. If you've seen one, you've seen them all. It didn't matter what fancy garbage you strapped to it. We have a total crew complement of 800, 200 officers, 500 enlisted, and 100 civilians and auxiliary staff, the man continued as if I hadn't spoken, but his words dragged me back into the conversation. I quirked an eyebrow at his comment. That was remarkably low for a station of this size. 800? I reiterated, looking forward again, down from what? I think the average is 4,000? The man said slowly, thinking about his answer. 5,000? Depends on the size, I suppose. How? I asked. A station this size, tending a fleet that size? Automation? Automation, it was a buzzword in the Empire, and not a particularly positive one at that. It was a cultural disdain for the word, one born of the most brutal conflict in modern history. Droids were viewed poorly in the Empire, and granting a large degree of control to a number of droids or drones was a social faux pas at best. A generation of Clone Wars veterans and their students would rather throw a dozen humans at a problem than a single droid. Of course, I wasn't much better, though I did not view droids with the same paranoia. I most certainly did not like them. Many people on Naboo still remembered the Trade Federation's invasion. Newt Gunray's name was a curse even to this day. As I said, the most advanced station in the Empire, the man preened under my surprise, as if he himself were in charge of it. Droids linked to a central computer handle day-to-day tasks and larger projects. There is a complement of around 1,000 Yavitha, but they mostly handle repair and construction. Efficient builders, I believe the governor lobbied to have them used instead of Wookiees on future projects, but I haven't heard much about that for a while. I was not so naive as to not realize what the other officer meant, slaves. Xenophobia was prevalent in the Empire, and that often presented itself in the form of slavery. I did not trust aliens, but my opinions of them otherwise was indifference. I was born in a city, somewhere Gungans rarely tread without good reason. They preferred their swamps and outskirt towns, and I had never had much of a reason to venture far from home. Eriadu was a different deal entirely. Xenophobia was prevalent, and it was one such example of hatred forming into slavery. The expansive and rapidly developing industrial backbone of Eriadu always required more bodies to grease its wheels. My early life was one of extremes, born on a world where the practice was abhorred and growing into adulthood on a world that reveled in it. For my part, I never trusted slaves. I peered at the Yavitha, for what else could they be, out of the corner of my eye, partially expecting them to lash out at any moment. Slavery represented a risk. Unenthusiastic laborers being forced to work rarely produced the best products, nor did their treatment engender loyalty. That was evidenced in the Pwek and their eagerness to work with and help me. I'd rather a dozen paid humans than a dozen enslaved Wookiees, though that was not to say I would refuse Wookiee laborers just so long as I didn't need to worry about them pulling my arms off. Perhaps I was a bit xenophobic, but I was practical. And paranoid. Still, a mere 2,000 souls is hardly enough to be efficient. You underestimate these Yavitha. If they are good at anything, it's building ships. Just one of them can strip a tie in half the time it would take a whole team of technicians. As we moved deeper into the station, we discovered more of its crew. Imperial officers and Navy troopers moved on their business, joined by the odd Yavitha. Most wore grey uniforms similar to those of the Imperials they walked among, appearing as technicians were it not for their obviously different species. One might have forgotten they were slaves, but even someone like me could notice the relationship. Humans interacted with each other, they stopped to talk, to bark orders, or a number of other social actions. The Yavitha did not, they moved with a purpose. They did not stop for a moment to speak with their overlords or each other, and the Imperials did not initiate either. It was as if the Yavitha were specters, walking from place to place entirely unnoticed by the world around them. We were turned down a hallway labeled administration, yet the number of Yavitha did not decline. The quality of security did increase, however. Navy troopers were replaced by white armored troopers, Navy commandos. Though their armor appeared similar, I could already feel the disdain emanating from my escort. Pale helmets turned to track us, hands tightened around carbines as both sides seemed eager to turn this growing tension into violence. Then, we arrived at our destination. Another pair of naval soldiers waited at an unmarked door, drawing to attention at our approach. The younger officer turned to face me, gesturing to the door. "Admiral Perret awaits you inside, sir. Your guards will need to remain outside." Naturally, I agreed, while subtly taking in the hallway. A few Navy commandos lingered at a distance, but my stormtroopers stood still as statues in a line along the opposite hallway. They were staring down the two door guards, who returned their glares with what I assumed was the same disdain. I hoped that when I stepped out of this room, it was not into a firefight. The inside of the chamber was not the conference hall I was expecting. 4 curved couches surrounded a central holotable, some sort of sporting event playing at the center. Paintings covered the 4 walls, even flanking the doorways, and were joined by more couches and beds. It was some sort of luxury room and something I had not been expecting aboard an Imperial repair station. 2 men awaited me, one physically and the other over a hologram. The present man was an officer, clearly Perret based on his rank plaques and uniform. The other, seated on the couch to Perret's right, was far more ostentatiously dressed. Though the blue glow hid color, it was clear he was wearing a white governor's uniform, a large fur shawl around his shoulders that slid under his body like a cape. He was portly, though with how his arms bulged under the sleeves of his uniform I had to wonder how much of that was muscle. His thinly mustachioed face turned to face me with an easy grin, even as his beady eyes seemed to drill into my soul. The most surprising part of the man's ensemble was not how he was dressed, but the 2 figures he held close to his body. They were Yevitha, females, though I did not know enough about the species to discern that based on their features. It was how they were presented that gave me the idea, provocative and low-cut dresses that would not have been out of place on Zeltros. Curiously, despite the intimate position, the Yevitha had the same devoid and cold expressions. Or perhaps their relationship was not consensual. "Captain Tullius, reporting," I said, ending that train of thought with a sharp salute to the 2 men. "Governor Wilik Narus," I'd nearly forgotten Narus was with me, his voice coming out low. The man had been oddly subdued as of late, as if losing baccarat had sapped all the cunning out of him. It was a welcome change. Narus was far too ambitious and egotistical for the former governor of a middle-of-nowhere planet. Perret rose and returned the gesture while the governor signaled to the couch opposite the admiral. "Welcome, Captain, Governor. Please, sit," the man said as a greeting, waving his hand vaguely before returning it to the shoulder of his rightmost companion. Narus and I stepped forward and claimed the 2 empty couches, leaving me across from Perret and Narus across from the other governor. There was a moment as Narus and I got comfortable, or tried to, in my case. The couch was too plush, too soft. Eventually, I just mirrored Perret's posture, back straight, sitting on the edge of the couch's front, with my legs crossed. Narus, meanwhile, seemed to melt into the cushions. His posture betrayed the comfort he must have been feeling, even if his face remained stony. "Gentlemen," the governor began after a moment, "I am Grand Moff Guido Weblin. This is Admiral Jean Perret. We are pleased that you have accepted our invitation." "We are honored, sir," I responded diplomatically. "As we are with your presence. Last I had heard, Death Squadron was mustering in the Model sector," Governor Weblin announced pleasantly, though his words appeared to be new news to Admiral Perret. The man looked from the governor to me with a new interest. "Death Squadron, not Arrowhead Command?" the officer reiterated, with Weblin responding before I had the chance. Sections of Arrowhead were folded into Death Squadron, officers handpicked by Hask himself. I gave a lopsided smile at that, knowing the truth of my selection. While Admiral Hask had selected his preferred cadre of officers, I was pulled to fill in the ranks and cover unwanted positions. a fact made clear by my separation from the rest of Arrowhead Command. It was an honor to be a member, however briefly, I said, once again maintain my diplomatic tone. The revelations about Lord Vader and what had happened aboard the second Death Star would make that far less of an honor, if proven true. Curiously, my words seemed to earn some confusion from Weblin. I suppose that leads into the question of the hour. Weblin spoke slowly, eyes gaining a certain intensity even under his jovial disposition. What are you doing here? I clicked my teeth together for a heartbeat, already having planned how I was going to deal with this conversation, yet freezing as I was put on the spot. The last time I had contact with the Greater Empire, I had spoken with Grand Admiral Chick on Roth Station. To be more exact, the last time I had interacted with Imperials outside Baccarat, I had fought my way off of Roth Station with my guards, killing a number of the station crew. Considering that Rand had probably not died since then, the latest news about me would have been attacking another Imperial. It was with this revelation that my heart froze. The latest news about me was treason. At that moment, I expected the door behind me to open, for Navy commandos to pour in with blasters and batons and binders to grab me. Just as suddenly, I calmed down. If they were going to arrest me, they would have done so when I boarded the station. Better yet, they would have decimated my section with their fleet before I could get close enough. They certainly wouldn't try to apprehend me when I was in a meeting across from the fleet's admiral. The reason for why that was escaped me, though I could theorize. It could be that Governor Rand was dead. Model was busy, after all. The rebels may have stumbled across Roth Station and wiped it out, silencing the governor before he could reach Imperial space. There was also the possibility that Rand had not had any contact with the Greater Empire, or news hadn't traveled this far yet. That seemed the less likely option. News traveled slow from that part of the galaxy, but not that slow, especially not when Weblin already knew about Death Squadron. I opted not to mention the confrontation if they did not. I suppose I should start with the aftermath of the battle? I said, not wanting to rehash what was old news. After the destruction of the Death Star and the Executor, Yet so early into my story, I was interrupted. Weblin jolted in his seat, eyes wide as the two consorts showed the first emotion since my arrival, squawking in surprise as they were nearly thrown from the couch they shared with the governor. Perret was leaning forwards now, surprise crossing his features even as his eyes gleamed with naked interest. The Death Star? Destroyed? I blinked, looking between either man before sharing a glance with Narus. He appeared as bemused by their alarm as I was. Was the Imperial propaganda machine really leaning that heavily into denial? They built a second one? That was Perret this time, silencing my train of thought once more. I suppose that makes sense, Weblin said after a moment, leaning back into his couch again and pulling the slaves close. Death Squadron doesn't move for just anything. A thought occurred to me, one that was hard to believe. They couldn't be ignorant, not this close to the core, not a governor and a fleet commander, surely. I cleared my throat, leaning forward and studying the two men. What news have you heard about Endor? About Model? Nothing, Weblin answered immediately. The deep core is a difficult place, Tullius. Hyperlanes shift constantly. We might technically be in the core, but those distinctions do not matter here. Local governors have begun fighting each other, Perret added, not uncommon, but usually the Empire does not let them go on for this long. I suppose the loss of yet another Death Star would distract Coruscant? It would seem that I will need to be the bearer of bad news, I said slowly, drumming my fingers on my knees as my nerves made themselves known once more. It wasn't just the Death Star that was destroyed. A significant portion of Death Squadron, the Executor. The Emperor was also lost. Lord Vader, Admiral Piet, the command staff aboard the Death Star. Weblin and Perret froze in their seats, alarm flashing across their features before they quickly squashed their emotions down. I glanced at Narus again, his lips set into a thin line and looking as if he had bitten into something sour. Certainly not the rebels? Perret breathed, his voice low. At my nod, he let out a long exhale and broke his posture. Propping his elbows up on his knees, he buried his face in his hands as Weblin cursed slowly under his breath. Do you have proof? Disbelief warred with alarm in Weblin's voice. Emperor Palpatine and Lord Vader were confronted by the rebel Luke Skywalker, only Skywalker left according to. I froze, realizing that using the word of a rebel was a bad idea. Sending a significant glance at Narus and willing him to stay quiet, I continued, Grand Admiral Osvaldchik, by all the stars. Perret groaned from behind his hands. Where is Admiralchik? Weblin asked, letting go of his consorts and leaning forward to study me closer through the hologram. Where is the rest of the Death Squadron? How are you here alone? I sighed inwardly before setting into the story of my travels since Endor. I had to alter the story of what had happened at Roth Station. Instead of Rand trying to conscript me, he let us go without issue, but the presence of rebels forced my section to retreat back into the Model sector. Our arrival at Bakura meant Narus could assist in the tale weaving, and over the next hour was covered the nearly 2 months since Endor. Weblin and Perret were a captive audience, asking questions when they arose but otherwise paying us their undivided attention. This is... Weblin stopped, humming to himself for a moment before continuing, I will find a way to communicate outside the deep core. The situation here now makes far more sense. Captain Tullius, Governor Narus, you have my thanks for bringing this information to us. Please, take some time to rest and recuperate there on Black 15. You have full access to her facilities while your vessel is repaired. The slaves are also at your disposal. Looking at the slaves at his sides, I was distinctly uninterested in whatever Weblin's idea of disposal meant. I bowed my head respectfully to him all the same. Weblin nodded to me before turning his gaze to Perret. Perret, ready the fleet. It is likely Black Fleet will be called to action at last. Yes, Governor. Perret rose to his feet and saluted, followed shortly by Narus and I. The hologram flickered and Weblin left the three of us. Perret's expression was distant and unreadable. Narus and I shared a glance and in a moment of growing kinship, nodded before making our way to leave. Ah, Captain, I froze and closed my eyes. Sit. Governor, please, leave us. I have some more strategic questions for the good captain. I turned to face Perret again, the intensity returning to the man's eyes threefold. Of course, Admiral, Narus responded with a gruff tone. The door opened and closed, leaving me with Perret alone. The Admiral had reclaimed his seat, gesturing now back to the couch I had been sitting in. Once seated, Perret spoke again. Your story is quite fantastical, Captain Tullius. Indeed, had it not been for the corroboration from Narus, I might have, though you a deserter. The ease with which Perret discussed an execution-worthy crime most certainly did not put me at ease, but he continued, instead, I find myself in awe. You are a credit not just to your fleet, but the Navy as a whole. The change from threat to compliment left me feeling lost, but I straightened my back all the same and bowed my head. Thank you, Admiral. We will have need of that courage and devotion in the coming months, Perret continued as if I hadn't spoken. He rose to his feet and began to walk around the room, eyes staring off into space as he spoke. The Emperor is dead, and without a clear line of succession, there will be a mad scramble to seize power by opportunistic governors and admirals. There will be a need for good and loyal officers of the Empire to step up and protect her from these would-be usurpers, as I'm sure you can agree. I am certain you are correct, Admiral, I agree mildly. Unfortunately, it is not just the exterior enemies that I fear threaten the sanctity of this empire, but interior ones as well. It is the duty of the Imperial Navy to protect that sanctity and ensure that the ruling council represents the will of the late Emperor properly. Black Fleet, and Black Sword Command in its entirety, is positioned perfectly to ensure the stability and security, and the loyalty of the council. Perret turned to me now, eyes alight with a fanaticism not out of place in a Complar official. Captain Tullius, you are a survivor of Endor, no, a hero of Endor, and it would be our honor for you to join your forces to ours as we march for Coruscant, to protect it as is our duty. Oh no. I smiled at the Admiral, hoping my terror and anger did not show. I would be honored, Admiral Perret, but my orders. You will fulfill your orders, Captain. Better, you will be the vanguard of a fleet to preserve the Empire. How can anyone on Coruscant doubt your loyalty then? What I couldn't understand was why he needed me or my ships. Hero of Endor? What madness was that? Again, I could theorize. Perhaps he didn't want me to go ahead and warn Coruscant what was coming, and killing me would be a dangerous prospect. Granted, he was already planning to invade Coruscant, for all intents and purposes, but if the ISB started asking uncomfortable questions of his subordinates like why did Perret murder an Imperial officer acting under Chick's orders, Perret might have been on the fast track to becoming the very dissident he claimed to be fighting against. And Governor Weblin? Weblin will follow, once he understands the necessity of this action. Otherwise, he will need to be convinced of its efficacy. I should have taken my chances at Baccarat. By your orders, Admiral, was what I said, rising to my feet and saluting. All the while, trying to plan a way to escape this madman and this blasted station. Capital ships: Conqueror, Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, Captain Rivager Tullius, Lieutenant Ashka Skriold, Commander Rius Harand, Chief Wyattru Matred, Commander Sienna Ree, and Colonel Raab. Intimidation: Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, Commander Miljan. Escapade: Shriwar, Shri-class battlecruiser. Cruisers: Intrepid, Victory I-class Star Destroyer, Lieutenant. Dead: Steadfast, Victory I-class Star Destroyer, Captain Zanus, Viscount, Strike-class medium cruiser. Contester: Strike-class medium cruiser. Absolution: Strike-class medium cruiser, Lieutenant Pax. Valor: Strike-class medium cruiser, Commander Titus Kane. Frigates: Spite, Carrack-class light cruiser. Loner, Carrack-class light cruiser, Lieutenant Lobanik. Carrack-class light cruiser. Carrack-class light cruiser. Corvettes: Overlord, Lancer-class frigate, Captain Forster. Justice, Lancer-class frigate, Commander Titus. Lancer-class frigate. Lancer-class frigate. DP-20 frigate. Marauder-class corvette. Baccarat 2, IR-3F class light frigate. Baccarat V, IR-3F class light frigate. Chapter 8, Galantos 3. Lieutenant Ashka Skriold. I will be remaining on Black 15 for the foreseeable future. As such, there are several tasks I require you to oversee. Tullius spoke with the usual dry and aloof cadence he used in day-to-day life, yet despite that familiarity, I winced internally. There was an unfamiliar sharpness in his tone, how some words were spoken or how a sentence stopped that betrayed his true emotions. Tullius was angry at the situation undoubtedly, but the harshness of his stare made it clear some was directed toward me. Speak with Colonel Mobb. I want my dissatisfaction with his actions on Baccarat known. He has also avoided reporting our material losses on the world, or gains, as it were. I am not unaware of the walkers that have mysteriously entered my storage bays. After that, I need an accounting of our fighter situation. Speak with Matred and gather the flight officers. I want plans written out on how to best evenly divide our remaining fighters across the section. The local quartermaster has been distinctly unhelpful in that regard. Also, this situation on the Escapade needs to be resolved until we reach the Loyalist space. Speak with Thorne and the ranking officials aboard, and find out if we need to deploy more security to the vessel. There is also the matter of the Wrath crew we spirited away. Find out what happened to them, and compile a list of our options regarding them. Yes, sir, I responded sharply, keeping my back straight and eyes level as Tullius rattled off his orders rapidly. Also, speak to the mining guild representatives. I would wager they have some idea where we can offload that mineral cargo. Beyond that, keep me updated on the status of the vessel. Ensure none of the Yevithans are left alone, even for a moment, even if you need to post Navy trooper squads to follow them. I winced again but nodded my understanding. Yes, sir. My tone was the same as I repeated the phrase. With that, Tullius cut the communication and I was left alone in the bridge conference room once again. A sigh escaped my lips before I could stop myself. It was a test, that much was obvious. My lapse in judgment regarding the mining guild and Panatha situation had shaken his faith in me, and now I needed to prove I was worthy of it again. Time was also of the essence, though not just out of fear of Tullius's diminishing patience. I knew my position was perilous. I was a young officer and one of a lower rank compared to my authority. Everyone wanted to jockey for the position as Tullius's favored subordinate, outside perhaps Matred and Harand. Especially when the man was not present, where he could see and disapprove of any political maneuvering from the crew. I straightened my back and fought my expression back into practiced indifference. Feeling markedly more presentable, I turned about and entered the bridge once more. It was notably empty now, a skeleton shift made up mostly of reservist crew members or officers pulled from the secondary bridge. The main shifts were getting their well-deserved rest, much like the rest of the crew that had been working non-stop since Baccarat, and before. It was a true reprieve, unlike that which we had on the expedition from Baccarat and Zoth. The tall, stooped figure of Harand drew my attention as he turned to face me. His dark eyes were unchanging as I met his gaze. I merely nodded at him before making my way to the elevator, calling a tram to meet me at the bottom. There was a distinct calm in the lower decks of the Conqueror, distinct, but hesitant. Sailors chatted softly in the halls, but their voices were always kept low as if waiting for an alarm klaxon to blare. Navy troopers continued their patrols in full kit, but some of the tension seemed to vanish from their shoulders. I could not speak for the rest of the section, but on the Conqueror at least there was a sense of tentative relaxation. It was telling of what the crew had been through over the last weeks that they treated any calm with suspicion. In time, this would pass. Here in the depths of Black Sword Command space, we were unlikely to be accosted by rebels or pirates or rampaging alien fleets. Unless, of course, we were to get caught up in a fight against or for the local Imperial fleet. Given the track record thus far, I was keeping my hopes at a reasonable level. There was a noticeable increase in activity the lower my tram took me, low-lifter droids and repulsor sleds transporting military hardware between the cargo bays. Unfortunately, this activity appeared centered around the ventral hangar bay, my destination. More cargo was filling the hallways the further we went, racks of blasters, crates of explosives, deconstructed web turrets. The passage became so packed that a squad of army troopers had to press themselves to the walls just to avoid being run overweight. The Conqueror didn't have an army trooper complement. While she had more than enough space to carry a full ground force, as all Imperial Star destroyers did, the Conqueror had never been dedicated toward the independent operations such an army was needed for. The Conqueror was a purely combat vessel, like most of Arrowhead Command's main fleet. Acclimators fulfilled that duty traditionally, and so it was rare that this ship carried anything more than her security complement and a small garrison of stormtroopers. Last I checked, the Conqueror did not have an army trooper detachment, though it was possible we had found them on Baccarat, or Roth, and somewhere in between. Driver, hold. I order, reaching and grabbing the man's shoulder. He acquiesced, bringing us to a halt next to the squad of army troopers. Recognizing either me or the rank, the men saluted. Sergeant, I said, noting the man's pauldron, it was Naval Security Black. What unit are you from? 522nd Naval Security, sir, the man rattled off immediately, Conqueror Detachment. Why are Naval Security in Army Trooper uniforms? I ask, making my tone stern despite being more curious than annoyed. The man froze, straightening further and looking slightly past my head. He had discipline enough not to glance at his fellows, who all shifted at my scrutiny. Sir. This equipment was seized from the Bakuran garrison under orders of Colonel Mob. And so you decided to wear it? Take it for a little spin. I drawl, eyes passing over the armor. Now that I was closer, it was clear none of these men had worn army trooper plates or uniforms. While I was no expert, I could identify a crooked strap there, a tunic cinched wrong there. Navy troopers did not traditionally wear armor, and if they did it was far lighter than what the men standing before me were wearing now. The man stuttered before quickly finding himself again, In accordance with Imperial Military Doctrine Handbook page 337, Section 8, Subsection 8b, I zoned the man out as he began to recite the justification for battlefield looting his superior had quoted to him and looked down the hallways again. With closer inspection, it was also clear that most of the hardware was not ours. Loose rocket launchers were stacked precariously against one wall, something I could now identify as a speeder bike with a tarp thrown over it, and so much more. Much of the equipment and the crates they occupied were stamped with the emblem of the Imperial Army. Equipment found and seized by naval security personnel may be used with approval, see page. Why is all of this out here? I interrupted the man, gesturing to the stacked items. The man stumbled mid-sentence, finally diverting his gaze from me to take in the mess. He swallowed, seemingly relieved that my attention was no longer on him and his equipment. Colonel Mob and Quartermaster Miran ordered full stock to be taken of the Conqueror's storage bays. Ordinarily this would be done using whatever station we're docked with to hold goods, but Colonel Mob wanted it all done in-house. Security, sir. Security, or Mob didn't want some officer on Black 15 seizing the hardware he rightfully stole. Keep going, I ordered the driver, falling back into my seat. We left the Navy troopers behind, racing down the hallways and toward the ventral hangared bay. It was a small mercy that the closer we got to the main hangar bay, the more organized the mess seemed to become. Clearly, Mob had at some point cared about keeping an organized system for his loot before giving up. Wide double doors greeted us, kept open and so allowing me to witness the chaos of the hangar bay. Every square inch seemed to be filled, cargo crates stacked half a dozen tall with pathways barely as wide as one to move between them. Lifted droids lurched unsteadily, balancing their loads between the Durasteel maze while at PT walkers, refit with a pair of large vice-like arms, shoved aside containers to make room. Far on the other end of the hangar bay, dangerously close to the shielding that separated the void from the ship's internal atmosphere, two large gangways sat alongside a pair of AT-AT walkers. For the love of... I breathed, before sucking in a sharp breath, suddenly outraged. Tullius was making a problem about the ingots I took when the hangar bay looked like this? It wasn't as if this all appeared yesterday, the week since we had left Baccarat he had to have. Oh, right. He was relieved of command on medical advice. On my advice. I sighed, a low and pained noise. I could have blamed Maitred or Harand, they were the more senior officers, but I would not let excuses justify incompetence. I dismounted the tram, it would be no use here, and marched into the hangar bay. Technicians directed me toward Colonel Mob, a trail that led deeper and deeper into the jungle of containers and cargo, some marked, but much more not. On the other side of the sea, a clearing was made, a buffer around the large walkers. A large hovering Mechno chair stood before them, seated atop it a stout and wide man in Navy Trooper black. Colonel Barton Mob, commanding officer of the Conqueror's security forces and those of the rest of the section. He also oversaw the away teams, when the need arose for the section to deploy its own meager ground forces. Regrettably, I knew very little about him, it was rare that I even saw him, little more than dealt with the enigmatic colonel. He had been on the Conqueror for longer than I had been and likely was one of her most senior officers, if only by time served. It was regrettable, as otherwise we might have been forewarned about his ardent kleptomania. I walked up to the colonel, hands at my back. He did not turn to face me. Mob's head was tilted back, his face angled up the walkers as he stared at them. I was briefly off-put, thinking the man was wasting time admiring his loot than organizing this mess, before his voice reached me over the roar of machinery. I know 74Zs need maintenance, but I don't want to waste time with them when we don't have riders. Stick them in the back. No, I haven't spoken to Tullius yet, he isn't answering my messages. No, I don't know, deal with it. The man held a communicator in one tight fist, eyes glazed over as he spoke with whoever was on the other end. An earpiece sat snug in his left ear, keeping private his conversation with whoever was on the other end. From the front, Mob's features were more easily definable. Mob was indeed wide, but the distribution of his fat was far from consistent. His cheeks were wide and rosy, or what I could see in any case. His cheeks were hidden but sideburns, though far from the more tasteful and trimmed affair on Tullius. They were massive, crawling down the sides of his face like great bushes before looping up around his cheeks and into an equally massive and obscene moustache. The brown whiskers were neatly trimmed and groomed, but appeared to fray despite Mob's best efforts. Dark, sunken eyes flicked to me as I walked into the Colonel's range of vision, but he did not stop speaking. "Yes. I see. Well, deal with it." One moment." He lowered the communicator and turned to face me fully, Lieutenant squealed. "To what do I owe the pleasure of a visit from the command bridge?" "Colonel Mob," I said, saluting the man sharply before continuing, "Captain Tullius requested that I speak to you about the events on Baccarat." "Events on Baccarat? You mean the seizure of the capital? Textbook work, really. Those Baccaran chaps weren't much of a fight. I think the Baccaran garrison put up more of a struggle when we liberated those walkers." You should have seen the look on their faces, Lieutenant. Of course, they weren't in much position to refuse, not with the rebels knocking down their doors. I blinked. Mildly impressed Mob had managed to say all that in a single breath and without pause. After a moment, I shook my head and addressed the Colonel again. "No, not that. At least, not right now. I was referring to the events preceding the Baccaran insurrection, when you ordered your forces to open fire on the demon." I bit my tongue, stopping the word before I could finish it. Demonstrators was not the word I wanted to use, terrorists, rebels, insurgents, but unfortunately, Tullius had used the word civilians, on the Baccaran civilians. Civilians? I don't remember civilians. Dissidents, rebels, rioters, not civilians. Again, I held my tongue and my knee-jerk reaction. I agreed with the Colonel, but for some reason, the captain did not. It could be that Tullius just didn't know what had happened on Baccarat itself, either that the deaths at the beginning were linked to the insurrection as a whole, or there was some point he was trying to make. I worried my lip with my teeth for a moment, scouring my mind for some reason Tullius might have cared whether the Baccarans were civilians or not. Unless it wasn't about the Baccarans specifically? "Colonel, were the rioters already revolting when you ordered your forces to open fire, or did that begin afterward? Does it matter?" Mob asked, his tone marking the question as rhetorical. A dissenter is a dissenter. I did not have the resources to quell it normally. Now I understood. It was clearer now than ever before that Tullius had a practical mind for these things. The Vasha situation came to mind, not making enemies of a local world while you were still trapped in the system. Mob's indifference to whether the Baccarans were rebellious or merely protesting was telling. What would happen if he were thrown into stressful situations when dealing with actual loyalists or friendly forces? Probably rob them blind, I decided, eyes drifting back to the pair of heavy walkers. "It does to Captain Tullius. Your overeagerness may well have cost us a great deal more than expected, had you failed in." "But I didn't," Mob interrupted me, spreading his arms wide as a gesture to the hangar bay at large, "as evidenced by the bounty I have secured. You and Captain Tullius appear to be worrying about something that didn't happen." Again, I was stumped, and again I was forced to figure out what I needed to say to get the Colonel to agree to at least discuss the potential of changing his tactics. How Tullius juggled these differing personalities I would never know, but I was suddenly very glad it would not be me going forward. I struggled, until at last a memory trudged out from my mind. Captain Tullius has been playing with the idea of expanding the squadron security complement into a full ground force. He had mentioned as much, but Tullius had said a lot of things over the last few weeks, of course, concerning its commanding officers. He would prefer to keep things close to home, as it were, within the fleet. But he needs reassurances that, with this larger force, you will be able to exercise restraint. "Restraint?" Mob repeated, almost offended as he crossed his legs, but I could see the naked greed in his eyes. I did not need to look at Mob's career to know playing naval security on a star destroyer was where he wanted it to end. Finally, his gaze locked with mine and he seemed to notice me. "Those depths had a cunning sharpness. I see your game, Lieutenant. Fine, if wearing the velvet glove is what he requires for me to be placed in charge, then I will. Inform the captain I'll have new rules of engagement by the next report. Satisfied? I nodded slowly, satisfied and relieved that it was as successful a move as it was. Now I was banking on Tullius honestly wanting to expand the section, rather than throwing the idea around. There is also the issue of your report on our stockpile, Colonel. I gestured vaguely around us to the sea of stolen goods, or lack thereof. This. I filed my report immediately after Baccarat. Mob waved a dismissive hand, but I was not so easily dissuaded. My mistake though it may have been, not pursuing this sooner, but I would not allow Mob to run roughshod over procedure. I must request that the report be resubmitted, Colonel. Mob waved a hand in my direction, neither accepting my request nor denying it. I am certain the captain will. Colonel, you can move your legs, I realized, staring at his now crossed legs. Mob looked down as well, making a humming sound. How astute. Why are you in a hover chair? Where did you even get one in a planetary garrison headquarters? Studying the chair now, I realized that it was far higher quality than expected. Fur-lined padding, velvet seats, plush and well-maintained, this was the wealthy aristocrat's hoverchair. Mob tapped at the controls on the right armrest, tilting the chair forward and allowing him to step down from it. He patted the machine, a pleased smile on his lips. It's comfortable, and I found it in the Bakuran Senate chambers. My hand twitched slightly, my nerves coalescing in a growing exasperation. I most certainly did not pity Tullius having to deal with the marbs of the galaxy. Was someone using it at the time? Who's to say? I don't get what the big deal is. The I-7 is a perfectly fine fighter, just because Incom is a bunch of rebels doesn't make that any less true. It's ugly. As if a TIE pilot had any room to criticize the aesthetics of a starfighter. There was a romanticism to the classic Venator and V-Wing duo that was lost when the Imperial series began carting around TIE fighters. I was in a conference room, surrounded by the ranking officers of the 2nd Squadron's fighter complement. What was left of them in any case, most of the flight commanders and captains were dead or out of commission, in the case of Homna. Some were present in person, but the majority were calling in via hologram. The rest were 2nd or 3rd stringers for command of their given squadrons, and even those were reduced to a motley assortment of fighters. The Skipray blast boats and TIE bombers had their pilots and crews pilfered to maintain some semblance of a stable fighter wing, but that was why this meeting was being held. The door opened again, allowing the portly form of Maitred and waddle in, his presence quieting any conversation immediately. Stay seated, he ordered, datapad in hand as he walked around the table. We will skip introductions and get to the matter at hand. Lieutenant Skriold is here on behalf of Captain Tullius, who wishes for us to address the current fighter situation for our fleet. I leaned forward as Maitred squeezed behind me before scooting aside as he took his seat. With a wheezy sigh, he was seated with the rest of us. The captain has not confirmed whether or not Black 15 will provide more craft for our reserves, so we are to assume what we have is what we'll get. With that being said, I have come to the difficult decision of approving the usage of ground attack TIE fighters in regular formations. I was taken aback by the response to this declaration, which was immediate and negative. Officers scowled, muttered mutinously amongst each other, and had some choice words for the army and its equipment. I honestly didn't see the issue. It was a starfighter with rocket pods. What was the big deal? Maitred had tried to explain it to Tullius, but neither of us had understood. Aerodynamics, wing position, differences in how the laser cannons were aimed, minute stuff. Then again, TIE fighters were fickle beasts. Who knew what effect a minor change might have on an experienced pilot? Even if we include them, we still don't have enough fighters to create more than a couple of full squadrons. The Steadfast is the only ship that can still field a full squadron, plus the Intimidation if she had those reinforcements. One officer said, a flight commander based on her plaques. I recognized her, though I couldn't remember if she was the TIE bomber or Skipray commander. That brings us to the issue in question. Maitred nodded to the officer before addressing the company at large. Tullius has ordered that the fighters be condensed into 2 full wings, one aboard the Conqueror, the other aboard the Intimidation. The squadrons from Steadfast, Contester, Absolution, and Loner will be moved to the Conqueror. The rest will be moved to the Intimidation. There was not much reaction to that information. The pilots likely didn't have any more connection to their home ships as they did any other in the fleet. That was what I deduced from that lack of reaction, in any case. Either way, Maitred would be calling the shots. The truer problem became apparent as one of the holograms spoke. Simple enough, why did this need to be an in-person meeting? With all wings becoming unified, we need to establish a new chain of command. Enough of you are still alive to create some conflict. Maitred grunted bluntly, and that caused some murmuring amongst the officers. Ranking officers and former subordinates, all of whom wanted their spot in the limelight. How many had been dreaming of the chance to jump to command of their squadron? It was the same cutthroat competition that took place on the bridge when Tullius or Harand or Maitred turned their backs. I sighed inwardly, realizing now why I was here, to keep an eye on the political maneuvering. Theirs and Maitred's. Where's Commander Homner? It goes without saying that he will be commanding the Conqueror detachment. One hologram officer said, looking up and down the group. Commander Homner was injured in the aftermath of Baccarat. He's out of Bacta now, but he lost an arm. We don't have the equipment to make him a replacement. Commander Ree is in command of Crimson Squadron. Then Commander Ree will take command. The officer announced with a wave of his hand, several nods joining his announcement. What is happening? I turned my gaze to Ree, the Roth recruit. The tall woman appeared equally as taken aback by these events, but took them in stride as she addressed the group. I am temporarily in command of Crimson, until either Commander Homner is fit for duty or a new, permanent officer is chosen. Command of a joint squadron should pass to whoever is next most senior, the delegation from the Steadfast as an example. Temporary or not, if you are good enough for the chief, you are good enough for me. The officer from before announced with a huff, again earning affirmations from his neighbors. That appeared to be the end of it, as another officer piped in. Flight Captain Malik should take over the Intimidation complement. He was the second of Turret Squadron. Out of the question, the man I assumed to be Malik scoffed, Commander Gerin is the obvious choice for. It was as if they were each competing to not be made commander of a squadron. No, that was exactly what was going on. I glanced at Maitred, only to find that the man was entirely unaffected by this bizarre display. The faith that the pilots showed Maitred, a bridge officer, was staggering. How many horror stories had I heard of pilots and crew second-guessing the ranking officer in the middle of an engagement? Such blind faith in a superior was certainly unheard of. Is this normal? I ask as I lean into Maitred. Behold the culture created by Tullius. The competent do not seek higher station, they are selected for it by virtue of their competence, Maitred whispered back, the amusement in his voice betraying him. How do you mean? Tullius handpicked every single person in his main bridge crew, from his officers to the guards, and everyone of rank in the others. Competence above all else gains you his attention and accolades, not blindly chasing promotion. They seem far more enamored by you, Wyattfu. At that, Maitred offered me a lopsided smile, amusement twinkling in his eyes as he stared at me. Captain Tullius, I was surprised, stopping dead in the middle of the hallway as I saw Tullius rapidly approaching me from the other end. It had been a couple of days since he had disembarked from the Conqueror, and his return was unannounced. Lieutenant, Tullius greeted me in turn. He strode right up to and past me, not slowing his stride for a heartbeat. I quickly turned on my heel and raced after him, back toward the officer quarters where I had been leaving. That was evidently the right decision, as he began speaking. The Yavitha will begin repairs in a few hours. I have not had the chance to speak with our security officers, but they are to be under close guard while aboard the Conqueror. Can you take care of this alongside your other duties? Was that doubt I heard in his voice? Had I shaken his faith in me that much? My heart beat faster, fear mixed with panic as his apparent disappointment. I nodded sharply before responding. Yes, Captain. I'll ensure they are kept under close scrutiny. Good, was all Tullius had to say on that. As if it were expected, Governor Naruse and I will be remaining on Black 15 for the time being. Have you and Matred already figured out our fighter situation? More like they figured it out themselves. Yes, Captain, was what I said instead. We have 2 full squadrons split between the Conqueror and Intimidation, plus reserves. They have agreed on a temporary chain of command until the squadrons can be reformed. Again, Tullius just nodded. The rest of our trek was thankfully silent. It was somewhat embarrassing to respond to Tullius between hastily drawn breaths. Our destination was his officer, untouched during his furlough. It was a barren affair, with little in terms of personal effects. Tullius moved around behind the desk, but instead of taking his seat he knelt and began fiddling with one of the drawers. This goes without saying, but our stay here was unplanned, Tullius said, not looking up as he worked. Stood on the other side of his desk, I couldn't see what he was doing, so I just nodded. Unfortunately, I have led us into yet another situation, and this is not one we can fight our way out of. Admiral Perret has decided that chaos is an opportunity to attack Coruscant and seize control for himself. I see. That was a lie, I did not see. I fought to keep my mouth closed, lest I gaped stupidly at this information. My mind was immediately cast to the trio of superstar destroyers. Such a force would be minuscule in the face of a concentrated Imperial response, but they were more than enough to intimidate Coruscant into whatever terms Perret had. I had little care for politics, but even I found myself boggled by the implications. If one renegade could threaten the Empire, who was to say another couldn't? Of course, the foundation of the Empire was too strong to be shaken by one event, but it set a precedent. Admiral Perret has also offered us a position among this fleet, as the vanguard to his crusade. Tullius vanished for a moment, ducking down before peeking his head up, lips curved upward in a smile. He even called me Hero of Endor. Catchy, no. There was a glint in his gaze, an anger betrayed in his narrowed eyes, or the forced nature of his smile. What are we going to do? I asked, and at once the smile vanished from his face. It was replaced by a scowl. What can we do? Sending a ship to warn Coruscant would be too obvious. We can't fight our way out, not against these odds. The best we could do is break away once we leave the system, put as much distance between us and Black Sword Command as we can. But that would leave the Escapade and our other comrades in their tender mercies. We can't run, we can't fight. Tullius clicked his tongue, finally standing as he pulled from his desk a bottle. It was a dark brown, text partially hidden in his hands, but I recognized it immediately as something alcoholic. I turned a scandalized gaze to Tullius. Sir. What? He asked, alarmed, before realizing the target of my scrutiny and shrugging. Oh. I needed an excuse to come here and speak to you in a way that is not monitored. At present, I need to make Perret view me positively. How better than to offer him a drink celebrating his coming ascension? Tullius turned the bottle to study it before shrugging. Tullius made his way back to the door before stopping suddenly and turning to face me again. Have you spoken with Thorn over on the Escapade? I was caught off guard by the change of topic, shaking my head after a moment. Not yet, Captain. I was going to complete my tasks here. It's no issue, Lieutenant, Tullius said, waving off my concern as he faced away from me again, a far-off expression on his face. Whenever you find time. With a nod, he walked off, leaving me to my thoughts in his office. What is on that ship? I wondered, that Tullius would want me to go there? Capital ships. Conqueror, Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, Captain Rivager Tullius, Lieutenant Ashka Skriold, Commander Rius Harand, Chief Wyattru Matred, Commander Sienna Ree, and Colonel Barton Raab. Intimidation, Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, Commander Miljan. Escapade, Shriwar, Shri-class Battlecruiser. Cruisers. Intrepid, Victory I-class Star Destroyer, Lieutenant. Dead. Steadfast, Victory I-class Star Destroyer, Captain Zanus. Viscount, Strike-class Medium Cruiser. Contesta, Strike Class Medium Cruiser. Absolution, Strike Class Medium Cruiser, Lieutenant Pax. Valor, Strike Class Medium Cruiser, Commander Titus Kane. Frigates. Spite, Carrack Class Light Cruiser. Loner, Carrack Class Light Cruiser, Lieutenant Lobanik. Carrack Class Light Cruiser. Carrack Class Light Cruiser. Corvettes. Overlord, Lancer Class Frigate, Captain Forster. Justice, Lancer Class Frigate, Commander Titus. Lancer Class Frigate. Lancer Class Frigate. DP-20 Frigate. Marauder Class Corvette. Baccarat 2, IR-3F Class Light Frigate. Baccarat V, IR-3F Class Light Frigate.